Story 1. The Visitor. The rain had started earlier than expected, turning the dusty streets into slick rivers that snaked through the neighborhood. The sky was a canvas of dark grays, occasionally split open by jagged streaks of lightning, followed closely by the deep rumble of thunder. Inside his house, Jack Harris sat alone, reveling in the solitude that only came with his parents' absence. At 13, he was just old enough to be left alone for the night, and the thrill of being the man of the house was intoxicating. He'd been waiting for this. His parents were attending a wedding out of town and had reluctantly agreed to let him stay home alone overnight. They had left him with a list of rules and emergency contacts, all of which he had promised to follow, though, in reality, he was already planning to ignore most of them. His first act of rebellion was dragging the Xbox from his room to the downstairs den, where the flat-screen TV and surround sound system would make his gaming experience infinitely better. The den was cozy, half a flight of stairs down from the living room, and it opened directly into the backyard. Jack had set himself up perfectly, snacks within reach, controller in hand, and the sound of the rain pattering against the windows adding to the ambience. He felt invincible, cocooned in the warmth of the house as the storm raged outside. The first flash of lightning was so bright it momentarily blinded him, and the subsequent crack of thunder rattled the windows. Jack paused his game, glancing out the sliding glass door to the backyard. The storm was getting worse, but instead of feeling anxious, it made him feel even more secure in his temporary fortress. As the night wore on, the storm grew more violent. Rain lashed against the windows, and the thunder boomed so loudly that it drowned out the sound effects of his game. Jack had just finished a particularly intense round of multiplayer when he heard the doorbell. It rang out sharply, cutting through the noise of the storm. Jack froze, the controller slipping from his hands. His first thought was that his parents had returned early, but that didn't make sense. They would have used their keys. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. His heart began to race. He wasn't supposed to answer the door while his parents were away. That was one of the rules. But the curiosity gnawed at him, urging him to at least see who it was. Maybe it was a neighbor in trouble or someone needing help in the storm. He muted the TV and slowly climbed the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The house seemed too quiet, the usual creaks and groans of the old structure amplified by his anxiety. When he reached the front door, he hesitated, listening for any signs of who might be outside. Who's there? He called, his voice sounding small and uncertain. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a man's voice answered, deep and calm. "I need to use your phone." My car broke down. Jack's mind raced. His parents had warned him about strangers, about not letting anyone in the house. But the man sounded polite, maybe even desperate. What if he really needed help? "I'm sorry, I can't let you in," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. There was another pause, and then the man spoke again, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. "Please, it's pouring out here. I just need to make a quick call." Jack glanced toward the window beside the door, but the rain-smeared glass revealed nothing but darkness. His instincts told him to walk away, to go back downstairs and lock himself in the den, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. The doorbell rang again, this time followed by a series of loud knocks. Jack jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should walk away, but he found himself reaching for the doorknob instead. Just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, he froze, his mother's voice echoing in his mind, "Never open the door to a stranger." He pulled his hand back, swallowing hard. "I can't help you." "I'm sorry." The man's voice changed then, the calm politeness giving way to something darker, more threatening. "Open the door, kid. I know you're in there." Jack's breath caught in his throat. How did the man know he was alone? Had he been watching the house? Panic surged through him, and he turned and bolted back down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. He ran to the den, slamming the door behind him and locking it. He stood there, trembling, listening to the storm battering the house. The sound of the rain on the roof was deafening, but he strained to hear anything else: footsteps, the door opening, anything that would tell him where the man was. For several long minutes, there was nothing. Then, just as Jack began to relax, he heard a faint creak coming from the back of the house. His blood ran cold. The backyard door. The man was trying to get in through the backyard. Jack's mind raced. He could call the police, but his phone was upstairs, and there was no way he was going back up there. The only other phone was in the kitchen, past the living room, and far too close to the back door for comfort. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there, waiting for the man to find his way inside. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the fireplace poker beside the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed the poker, feeling its weight in his hands. The metal was cool and solid, and it gave him a small measure of comfort. He crept toward the den's sliding glass door, careful to stay out of sight. The rain was still coming down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see anything outside. Jack pressed himself against the wall, listening intently. The sound of the storm was almost overwhelming, but beneath it, he could hear something else: a soft, repetitive tapping. His heart skipped a beat. The man was right outside the door, tapping on the glass. Slowly, Jack turned his head to look. The den was dark, but a flash of lightning illuminated the room just enough for him to see a shadowy figure standing on the other side of the glass. The man was tall, his features obscured by the rain, but Jack could see his hands pressed against the door, his fingers curled into fists as he tapped on the glass. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The man wasn't trying to break in. He was toying with him, testing his resolve. For a moment, Jack considered running, making a break for the front door and fleeing into the storm, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The man was too close, and he had no idea what awaited him outside. He had to think, had to find a way to outsmart the intruder. He glanced around the room, searching for anything that might give him an advantage. The den was sparse, mostly filled with old furniture and shelves of dusty books. His gaze landed on the small window above the couch, just big enough for him to fit through. It was a risky move, but it might be his only chance. If he could slip out the window and circle around to the front of the house, he might be able to escape before the man realized what he was doing. Jack tightened his grip on the poker and edged toward the window. The man outside hadn't moved, still tapping away at the glass with a maddening consistency. Jack reached up, unlatched the window, and pushed it open as quietly as he could. The wind howled through the opening, sending a chill down his spine. He hoisted himself onto the couch, careful not to make any noise, and started to wiggle through the window. His heart was pounding so loudly, he was sure the man outside could hear it. The cold air hit him like a wall as he emerged into the night, the rain instantly soaking him to the bone. He landed on the wet grass, the impact jarring his legs. For a moment, he crouched there, his eyes darting around in the darkness, searching for any sign of the intruder. The storm was relentless, the wind whipping the trees into a frenzy and obscuring his view. Jack forced himself to move, creeping along the side of the house toward the front yard. The rain was so heavy he could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he pushed on, knowing he had to get away before the man realized he was gone. As he reached the corner of the house, he paused, peering around the edge. The front yard was empty, the driveway dark and deserted. He could see the faint outline of the road beyond, leading away from the neighborhood and into the woods. It was a long shot, but if he could make it to the road, he might be able to flag down a passing car or find a neighbor to help him. Taking a deep breath, Jack sprinted across the front yard, the wet grass slick under his feet. He reached the driveway and bolted down the street, his mind racing with fear and adrenaline. The storm was at its peak now, the wind howling through the trees and the rain pounding the pavement like a relentless drumbeat. He didn't stop running until he reached the end of the street, where the road branched off into the woods. Panting and drenched, he glanced back at his house. The windows were dark, the entire place shrouded in shadows. He couldn't see the man, but that didn't mean he was gone. Jack knew he couldn't go back. Not yet. He needed to find help, and fast. He turned toward the woods, his thoughts racing. There was a trailhead nearby that led deeper into the forest, where he might be able to find shelter or stumble across a late-night hiker who could help him. But as he took his first step toward the trail, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, and Jack froze. Standing at the edge of the woods, just a few yards away, was the man. His face was still obscured by the rain, but Jack could see his eyes glinting in the darkness, locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Jack's heart lurched in his chest. The man had been waiting for him, anticipating his every move. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping this. The man wasn't just some random stranger. He was hunting Jack, playing a twisted game of cat and mouse. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Jack's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the man was already moving, stepping out of the shadows and into the light of the next lightning strike. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes clinging to his frame, soaked through from the storm. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes burned with a manic intensity. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he turned and bolted down the road, his feet slipping on the wet pavement. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, quick and determined, closing the distance between them. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he pushed himself to run faster. The road curved ahead, disappearing into the darkness, but Jack didn't slow down. He knew he couldn't outrun the man forever, but he had to try. He had to find some way to escape, some place to hide. The rain blurred his vision, and he could barely see where he was going, but he kept running, the sound of the man's pursuit driving him forward. He rounded the bend in the road and skidded to a stop, his heart leaping into his throat. Ahead of him, the road was blocked by a fallen tree, its massive trunk lying across the pavement like a barrier. The storm must have brought it down, and there was no way around it. Jack's mind raced, panic threatening to overwhelm him. He was trapped. The only way out was back the way he came, but the man was right behind him. Jack spun around, his eyes darting through the darkness, searching for any sign of his pursuer. Another flash of lightning lit up the road, and Jack saw him just a few yards away, moving with deliberate purpose, his eyes locked onto Jack. The man's face twisted into a grin, a chilling, predatory smile that sent a jolt of fear through Jack's entire body. He had no choice. He had to confront the man. Jack tightened his grip on the poker, his knuckles white with fear. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his ears, and raised the weapon, ready to defend himself. The man slowed his pace, his grin widening as he approached. He seemed to relish the fear in Jack's eyes, feeding off it like a predator toying with its prey. "What do you want?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and terror. The man didn't answer. He simply continued to advance, His eyes gleaming with the cold, malevolent light, Jack's breath caught in his throat. This was it. There was no escape, no more running. He had to fight, had to stand his ground. He raised the poker higher, bracing himself for the inevitable clash. But just as the man reached him, another flash of lightning illuminated the road, revealing something Jack hadn't seen before. Another figure, standing behind the man, shrouded in the darkness of the storm. This figure was different, smaller, but equally menacing, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Jack's heart skipped a beat. There were two of them. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a random attack, this was something else, something far more sinister. Before Jack could react, the second figure lunged forward, grabbing the man from behind and pulling him back into the shadows. The man let out a strangled cry, his grin vanishing as he struggled against the unseen force. Jack watched in horror as the two figures disappeared into the darkness, their shapes swallowed by the storm. For a moment, the only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain, the thunder echoing through the night, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the storm began to abate. The wind died down, the rain eased to a gentle drizzle, and the clouds began to break apart, revealing a sliver of moonlight. Jack stood there, trembling, the poker still clutched in his hand. His mind was reeling, unable to process what had just happened. Who were those figures? What did they want? And why had the second figure saved him? He didn't have any answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay there any longer. He had to get away, had to find help, and he had to do it now. With one last glance at the spot where the figures had vanished, Jack turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the quiet night as he disappeared into the darkness. Story 2. Under the Bed. The night had been relentless, the storm beating against the house like an angry beast, each gust of wind howling through the eaves, and every clap of thunder rattling the windows. Inside, Emily Thompson lay in her bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her like a thick, suffocating blanket. It was just after a.m., and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Emily had always loved thunderstorms as a child, finding comfort in the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof. But tonight was different. There was something malevolent in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She had moved into this house 6 months ago, eager to start her new life in a place far from the chaos of the city. The house, a charming 2-story Victorian with creaky floorboards and a wrap-around porch, had seemed perfect at first. It was quiet, isolated, surrounded by woods that offered both privacy and an eerie sense of seclusion. But as the weeks passed, Emily began to notice small things at first. A door left open that she was sure she had closed, the creak of footsteps on the stairs when she was alone, the occasional feeling of being watched. She had brushed it off as her imagination, the result of too many late nights and too much coffee. But the feeling of unease never quite left her. Now, lying in the dark, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The storm was loud, but beneath the roar of the wind and rain, she thought she could hear something else, a faint, repetitive noise, almost like a tapping or a scratching. It was so soft that she wasn't even sure if it was real or just her imagination playing tricks on her. Emily turned onto her side, pulling the blankets up to her chin, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on her. But the noise continued, persistent and unnerving. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in the room, but she couldn't quite place where. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows, trying to find the source of the sound. The candle on her bedside table had burned low, its flame sputtering and threatening to go out, leaving the room in near darkness. Emily's breath quickened, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. She reached over and grabbed her phone from the nightstand, switching on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar shapes of her furniture, the dresser, the bookshelf, the chair by the window. Everything was in its place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the tapping continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. Emily sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She aimed the flashlight around the room, the light trembling slightly in her hand. The beam swept across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, but still, she saw nothing that could explain the noise. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. No response. The only sound was the tapping, steady and relentless. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but something about this night, this storm, was different. It felt like the house was alive, like it was trying to tell her something. Summoning her courage, Emily swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. She kept the flashlight trained on the floor, moving slowly, cautiously toward the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the far side of the room, near the closet. As she approached, the tapping grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from inside the closet. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but she couldn't bring herself to move. It was as if the storm had trapped her there, rooting her to the spot. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the doorknob and yanked the closet door open. The flashlight beam darted inside, illuminating the rows of hanging clothes and the boxes stacked on the floor. Everything was still, undisturbed. Emily let out a shaky breath, relieved but still uneasy. She was about to close the door when something caught her eye, something small and dark in the back corner of the closet. She shone the flashlight on it, squinting to see what it was. It was a small hole in the wall, no bigger than a golf ball. Emily frowned, leaning closer. The house was old, and she had discovered a few oddities here and there since she had moved in, but she had never noticed this hole before. It looked almost like someone had drilled it deliberately, but why? The tapping sound had stopped the moment she opened the closet door, and now there was only silence. Emily reached out a hand, running her fingers along the edge of the hole. It was smooth, as if it had been carefully carved out. She leaned in closer, peering through the hole, but it was too dark to see anything on the other side. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of vent, or a hole left behind by previous renovations. But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would there be a hole in the back of her closet, hidden behind clothes and boxes? Suddenly, she heard it again, the tapping, but this time it was coming from behind the wall. Emily jerked back, her heart racing. She stared at the hole, her mind reeling. There was something or someone on the other side of that wall. Her first instinct was to cover the hole, to block whatever was on the other side from getting through. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it was too late. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming closer, moving toward the hole. Emily backed away from the closet, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. She turned and bolted for the door, intending to flee the room, but as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a different sound, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible over the storm. It was coming from behind her, from the closet. Emily, the voice was soft, almost soothing, but it filled her with a dread so intense she thought she might faint. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice called her name again, and this time it was closer, just behind her, as if whoever or whatever was speaking was right there in the room with her. Slowly, As if compelled by some unseen force, Emily turned around. The flashlight beam wavered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Her eyes were drawn to the closet, to the darkened hole in the wall, and then she saw that something was moving in the darkness, a shape shifting in the shadows. It was small at first, but it grew larger, filling the hole, pressing against it, as if trying to push through. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out, but she was paralyzed with fear. She watched in horror as a hand emerged from the hole, thin and pale, its fingers long and bony, like the hand of a corpse. The hand groped around blindly, as if searching for something, and then another hand followed, pulling at the edges of the hole, widening it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. As she realized what was happening, the thing was trying to crawl through, to get into the room. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall, her flashlight falling from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and she could hear the thing in the closet, hear its labored breathing as it squeezed through the hole, inching its way into her world. "Emily," the voice whispered again, and this time it was coming from inside the room. She had to get out. She had to run. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, Emily bolted for the door. She yanked it open and ran into the hallway, not daring to look back. She could hear it behind her, the soft, shuffling footsteps, the whispering voice calling her name. She reached the stairs and took them two at a time, her bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. The house was a maze of shadows, the storm raging outside, but she didn't care. She had to get out, had to escape. She reached the bottom of the stairs and sprinted for the front door. Her hand fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling as she tried to turn the deadbolt. The whispering was closer now, almost right behind her. Finally, the lock clicked open, and Emily yanked the door open, the wind and rain slamming into her as she stepped outside. She ran into the storm, not caring about the cold or the wet, just needing to get as far away from the house as possible. She didn't stop running until she reached the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned back, staring at the house, half expecting to see the thing standing in the doorway, watching her. But the doorway was empty, the house dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Emily stood there, soaked to the bone, her mind racing. What had she seen? What was that thing in her closet? She knew she couldn't stay there, couldn't go back inside. But she also knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing what that thing was, what it wanted. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to walk back to the house. The storm seemed to ease slightly as she approached, the wind dying down, the rain lessening to a drizzle. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her ears. The house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the dripping of water from her clothes onto the floor. She stood in the foyer, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. The house was still, as if whatever had been there was gone, as if it had never existed at all. But Emily knew better. She could still feel its presence, lingering in the shadows, waiting. She took a step forward, her foot hitting something solid. She looked down and saw her flashlight, lying on the floor where she had dropped it. She picked it up, her fingers shaking as she switched it back on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and Emily forced herself to walk back up the stairs, her heart in her throat. She had to see. She had to know. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in on her as she approached her bedroom door. It was ajar, just as she had left it, but the closet door was wide open now, the darkness inside it yawning like a black hole. Emily stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat as she shone the flashlight into the closet. The hole in the wall was gone, the plaster smooth and unbroken, as if it had never been there at all. She backed away, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? Had the storm and the darkness played tricks on her mind? But no, she couldn't have imagined it. She had seen the hand, had heard the voice. Emily turned to leave, her hand on the doorknob, but something made her stop. She turned back to the bed, her flashlight sweeping across the floor. She hesitated for a moment, then dropped to her knees, lowering the flashlight to peer under the bed. Her heart stopped. There, in the darkness beneath the bed, were two glowing eyes, staring back at her. They were red, bloodshot, filled with a malevolent hunger. Before she could react, the thing lunged at her, its skeletal hands grabbing her by the throat, pulling her down into the darkness. Emily screamed, but the sound was cut off as the thing dragged her under the bed into a place where the light couldn't reach, where the storm couldn't save her. Her last thought, as the darkness swallowed her whole, was that she should have listened to her instincts. She should have run when she had the chance. Story 3. The Cabin in the Storm. The storm began as a distant rumble, the kind of sound that you might mistake for the far-off roar of an engine or the rolling of waves if you weren't paying attention. But as the day wore on, the clouds thickened, darkened, and the air became heavy with the promise of something more. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, Cass and Mike were well into the woods, driving up the narrow, winding road that led to the cabin. It had been Mike's idea to get away for the weekend, to escape the pressures of work and the chaos of the city. He had inherited the cabin from his grandfather, who had built it with his own hands, deep in the forest where few ventured. Cass had been reluctant at first. She wasn't much of an outdoors person, and the idea of spending a weekend in a remote cabin without Wi-Fi or cell service didn't exactly thrill her. But Mike had assured her it would be a relaxing retreat, a chance to reconnect with nature and with each other. As they approached the cabin, the rain began to fall more heavily, drumming on the roof of the car like 1,000 tiny fists. The wind picked up, whipping the trees into a frenzy, their branches thrashing against each other like angry beasts. "Looks like we're in for a real storm," Mike said, glancing at Cass with a grin. "Good thing we made it up here before it hit." Cass forced a smile, though she couldn't shake the unease that had been gnawing at her since they left the city. There was something about the storm that felt different, more intense than anything she'd experienced before. Mike parked the car in front of the cabin and shut off the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. "Ready?" he asked. Cass nodded, though she wasn't sure she was. They grabbed their bags from the back seat and made a run for the cabin, the rain soaking them to the skin in seconds. Mike fumbled with the key, his hands slick with rain, before finally getting the door open. They tumbled inside, laughing despite themselves, and slammed the door against the wind. The cabin was small and cozy, with a stone fireplace, worn leather furniture, and wooden beams that creaked softly as the wind battered the walls. The windows were thick with condensation, blurring the view of the storm outside. Mike set down the bags and rubbed his hands together. "Let's get a fire going. It'll warm this place up in no time." Cass nodded, dropping her bag on the floor and peeling off her soaked jacket. She wandered over to the window, wiping a patch of glass clear with her hand. The view outside was almost apocalyptic, the trees bending under the force of the wind, the rain coming down in sheets, and the sky a swirling mass of dark clouds. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't realize it would be this bad." Mike crouched by the fireplace, stacking logs and kindling. "It's just a storm, Cass. Nothing to worry about. We're safe here, safe." The word echoed in her mind, but it brought her little comfort. The storm felt like more than just a natural phenomenon. It felt like a force, an entity with a will of its own. And it was angry. Mike struck a match and lit the fire, the flames crackling to life, casting a warm glow across the room. He stood up, dusting off his hands, and crossed the room to where Cass stood by the window. "Hey," he said softly, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You okay?" She nodded, forcing another smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, I don't know. The storm is a little freaky, that's all." Mike chuckled. "You're just not used to being out here. It's different from the city, but that's why I love it. It's like a whole other world, you know. Out here, it's just us and the elements. It makes you feel alive." Cass looked at him, her unease softening at the sight of his boyish enthusiasm. Mike had always loved the outdoors, the wildness of it, the sense of adventure. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Maybe you're right," she said, leaning into him. "I'm just being silly." He kissed the top of her head. "You're not silly. But I promise there's nothing out there that can hurt us. The cabin's solid, and the storm will blow over by morning. We'll be fine." Cass nodded, but a part of her still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She turned back to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out into the storm. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the woods, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something moving between the trees, something tall and dark, like a figure. She blinked, pressing her face closer to the glass, but the lightning was gone, leaving only the darkness and the rain. Her heart skipped a beat, and she pulled away from the window, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" Mike asked, noticing the change in her demeanor. I thought I saw something." Outside in the woods, Mike frowned, peering out the window beside her. "What did you see?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It was just a shadow, maybe. But it looked like a person." Mike squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "It's probably just the trees. The wind's playing tricks on your eyes. There's no one out there, Cass." She nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her gut remained. "Yeah, you're probably right." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the image of that dark figure lurking in the woods, watching them. They spent the next hour trying to relax, but the storm only grew worse. The wind howling like a wild animal, the rain hammering against the cabin with a fury that seemed almost personal. Mike tried to distract Cass with a movie, but the signal was too weak to stream anything, and they quickly gave up. They settled on the couch by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot chocolate. Mike talked about the history of the cabin, stories his grandfather had told him about the old days, but Cass found it hard to focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the figure she thought she'd seen in the woods. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind whipped around the cabin, rattling the windows and making the wooden beams groan. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Cass stared into the flames, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about that figure. What if it wasn't just her imagination? What if there was someone out there, watching them? The thought sent a chill down her spine, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Mike must have sensed her tension because he set his mug down and turned to her, his expression serious. "Cass, I know you're freaked out, but I promise there's nothing out there. The storm is bad, sure, but we're safe in here. The cabin's been through worse storms than this. We'll be fine." She wanted to believe him, but something in her gut told her otherwise. "I don't know, Mike. I can't shake this feeling that we're not alone out here." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'll prove it to you." He stood up and grabbed a flashlight from the shelf by the door. "I'll go outside and take a look around, okay? Just to put your mind at ease." Cass's eyes widened in alarm. "No, Mike, don't go out there. It's too dangerous." But Mike was already pulling on his jacket. "I'll be fine. I won't go far, just around the cabin. I'll be back in 5 minutes, tops. Please, Mike," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't leave me alone." He hesitated, his expression softening. "Cass, I'll be right back. I promise. You can keep the fire going, and I'll be back before you know it." She wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't going to let her fear get the best of him. Reluctantly, she let go of his arm, her heart pounding in her chest. "Okay," she whispered. "But be careful," he nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I will. Lock the door behind me." She watched as he opened the door and stepped out into the storm, the wind and rain swallowing him up in an instant. She quickly shut the door and locked it, her hands trembling. Cass stood there for a moment, staring at the door, listening to the sounds of the storm raging outside. She couldn't hear Mike anymore, couldn't see him through the rain-streaked windows. The cabin suddenly felt much larger, much emptier. She paced the room, trying to calm her racing heart. Mike would be back soon, she told herself. He was just checking things out, making sure everything was okay. He'd come back inside, and they'd laugh about how silly she'd been to worry. But as the minutes ticked by, that reassurance began to fade. The storm seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows with such force that she feared they might shatter. Where was he? He said he'd be back in 5 minutes, but it felt like much longer. Cass found herself glancing at the clock, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. Then, just as she was about to grab her own jacket and go after him, she heard a faint sound, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was on the porch, moving slowly, deliberately. Cass's heart leapt into her throat. "Mike," she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps continued, moving closer to the door. Cass backed away, her eyes fixed on the handle. The fire crackled behind her, but it did nothing to warm the cold dread that had settled over her. She reached for the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly in her hands. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence, broken by the relentless pounding of the rain. Then slowly, the door handle began to turn. Cass's breath caught in her throat. She raised the poker, ready to defend herself. The handle turned all the way, but the door didn't open. It was locked, she reminded herself. Whoever was out there couldn't get in. But they were trying. The handle rattled, the door creaking as if something was pushing against it. Cass took a step back, her pulse racing. Was it Mike? Had he forgotten his key? But why wouldn't he answer her? "Mike," she called again, her voice barely more than a whisper, still no answer. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm. Cass stood frozen, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for anything to happen. Suddenly, the door was pounded by a heavy blow, the wood groaning under the force. Cass jumped, nearly dropping the poker. Another blow came, then another, each one more violent than the last. "Mike, stop!" She screamed, her voice shaking with fear. "What are you doing?" But deep down, she knew it wasn't Mike. Something else was out there, something that wanted to get in. The blows continued, the door shuddering with each impact. Cass backed away, her mind racing. She had to do something, but what? She couldn't stay in the cabin, not with whatever was out there trying to break in. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The windows were no good, they were too small, and even if she could fit through them, she'd be exposed to the storm. The only other door was the one that led to the back porch, but it was even less secure than the front door. The blows continued, each one more desperate, more furious. Cass could hear the wood splintering, could see the door buckling under the force. She had to get out, had to find Mike. Without thinking, she ran for the back door, fumbling with the lock in her panic. The door swung open, and she stumbled out onto the porch, the wind and rain hitting her like a wall. She could barely see through the storm, but she didn't stop. She ran down the steps and into the woods, calling Mike's name over and over. The trees loomed around her, their branches thrashing in the wind, but she pushed on, desperate to find him. "Mike," she screamed, her voice hoarse from the cold and fear. But there was no answer, only the relentless roar of the storm. She tripped over a root, falling to her knees in the mud. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for breath, her body shaking with exhaustion and terror. She couldn't give up. She had to find Mike, had to make sure he was safe. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Cass pushed herself to her feet and stumbled forward, deeper into the woods. The storm seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing down on her like a weight. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, the rain blurring her vision, but she kept going, driven by the desperate need to find Mike. Then, through the rain, she saw it, a faint light, flickering in the distance. Hope surged through her, and she stumbled toward it, her heart pounding. It had to be Mike. He must have found shelter, built a fire. But as she got closer, the light took on a different quality, paler, colder. It wasn't a fire. It was something else, something unnatural. Cass slowed, her fear returning with a vengeance. She stopped just at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching in her throat. The light was coming from the cabin, but it wasn't the cabin she had left behind. This one was different, older, more decayed. The windows were broken, the walls sagging, and the roof partially collapsed. The light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Cass's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The cabin couldn't be real. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a twisted reflection of the place she had just fled. But then she saw him, Mike, standing in the doorway, his back to her, his body silhouetted against the pale light. "Mike," she cried, relief flooding through her. He didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness inside the cabin. "Mike, what are you doing?" "We have to get out of here." But he still didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. Cass felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She took a step closer, her heart pounding. "Mike," finally, he turned to face her, and Cass's blood ran cold. It wasn't Mike. Not anymore. His face was pale, almost corpse-like, his eyes hollow and empty. His lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, and as he stepped toward her, she could see the darkness spreading across his skin, like veins of ink crawling up his neck and into his eyes. "Cass," he said, his voice distorted, echoing as if from a great distance. "Come inside." She stumbled back, shaking her head in terror. "No, Mike, please." But he kept coming, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The smile never left his face, even as he reached out a hand toward her. "Cass," he repeated, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Come inside." She turned and ran, her screams lost in the wind. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps crunching on the leaves and twigs, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. The storm seemed to close in around her, the darkness swallowing her whole. She ran and ran until she could run no more, her legs giving out beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She was lost, alone in the woods, with no idea where she was or how to get back to the cabin, but she couldn't go back, couldn't face what had become of Mike. She lay there, sobbing as the storm raged around her, her mind racing with terror. Then, through the darkness, she heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, singing an eerie, haunting melody that sent chills down her spine. Cass looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The light was gone, the woods silent and empty. But the voice continued, closer now, echoing through the trees. She forced herself to her feet, her heart pounding. She had to move, had to keep going. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, her body shaking. The voice followed her, growing louder, more insistent. Double quotes, Cass double quotes, it was Mike's voice, distorted and hollow, calling her name. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was inside her head, whispering to her, drawing her deeper into the woods. She kept moving, tears streaming down her face. The storm raged on, the darkness pressing in on her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, she saw it, a faint light through the trees. The cabin. The real cabin. She stumbled toward it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had made it back, but as she reached the clearing, she froze. The light wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the woods, from the decayed cabin she had seen before, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mike. His face was twisted into that same grotesque smile, his eyes empty and dark. "Cass," he called, his voice echoing through the storm. "Come inside." She turned and ran, her screams lost in the wind. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.